So what are many people across the province of Canada talking about right now? It's the new COVID-19 variant known as Omicron. Now, with around 30,000 active cases, many are quite concerned with this highly contagious virus. Now, there's some reports, however, that it may not be as strong as the Delta variant. To talk about what the government is doing to protect us here is our legislative reporter and the Alberta correspondent with the National Post, Tyler Dawson. Happy New Year, Tyler.
Happy New Year to you too, Hal.
Thanks so much. Now, the winter break was extended for students until January the 10th. But what is the province really doing to help stop the spread of the variant? Or can anything really be done at all?
Yeah, well, I mean, if you were to ask the New Democrats, I think they would probably say nothing's being done. And the United Conservatives would counter and say that Alberta has, sort of among the strongest health restrictions in the country. Of course, people will remember a couple weeks ago when the government sort of relaxed some of its restrictions for Christmas. They relaxed them at the same time that other provinces were tightening theirs. But of course, they all sort of ended up in a similar kind of ballpark of restrictions. So the government would say, that's sort of what they're doing to keep people safe while keeping an eye on the variant, which, as you mentioned, has about 30,000 active cases in Alberta, but doesn't seem just yet to see hospitalizations and deaths following. And as you alluded to, there's some indication this might be more mild. Obviously, there's relatively high vaccination rates in the province. Boosters have been rolled out. So there's all these sorts of things sort of happening. And but certainly, it does feel like a little bit of a waiting game. If we go back a year and a half ago, almost 2 years ago now, I feel like it was like 200 cases and, everything was shut down out of an abundance of caution. And now, we look at 30,000 and we're like, ooh, that's pretty bad. But, the tools may be in place. People maybe know what they need to do. Masking is required, things like that. So certainly it'll be an interesting couple weeks on the virus front, I think.
Now, Tyler, the province rolled out rapid antigen tests and then ran out of them. A lot of pharmacies I went to, they said, no, we ran out hours ago. Now, meanwhile, boosters have also fully opened up. The province also cut isolation times for the fully vaccinated. It went from 10 to 5 days. Now, the reason why the time was cut down is that people need to get back to work.
Yeah, so these are, a couple of the other things that are sort of percolating here. As you alluded to, a real sort of Hunger Games scenario with the rapid antigen tests, people waiting in lines, trying to find them. I was actually on the way to get groceries the other day and I saw a lineup outside my neighborhood pharmacy and I was like, oh, they must have tests. And stopped on the way back home and waited in line for about half an hour to get one. And boosters obviously opened up to the entire population as well, not just those sort of 60 plus and 50 plus, which was sort of the last increments. But as you say, isolation requirements have changed. We've all been sort of used to this 10-day isolation for the duration of the pandemic, and it's now down to 5. And that's for people who are not symptomatic, who are fully vaccinated. Obviously, if you're coughing up a lung, don't go to work on day 6. But yeah, they basically are saying that, there's the risk of sort of a staff and labor shortage. You talk to some small business. I've got friends who work in retail who are saying that, yeah, they've got like 30% of their workforce off right now. So it's a real risk there. This decision has been absolutely panned by labor unions. Other provinces have followed suit as well. Jerry Diaz, the head of Unifor, when I talked to him earlier this week, saying that this was putting profits over people. So kind of controversial, but this is following in the steps of other provinces. The CDC in the United States has made similar recommendations. So it's, a controversial decision, but it's sort of an interesting one. And frankly, I think it's a bit hard to say what the impact of that will be, maybe either on the labor force or on the spread of the virus.
Now, as we discussed earlier, the return to classes has been delayed until January the 10th. Now, this should give teachers time to prepare, and millions of rapid tests and masks will be available for students. Now, the opposition NDP says students need more support. What support specifically they're talking about?
Well, they're talking about a number of things. So they want N95 masks given out, not just medical grade masks. Those are sort of the more sealed, tightly sealed ones. They want mental health counselors in school. They want a fund created to support families whose kids are at home, and things like that. So, and they also want HEPA filters in schools to, I guess, clean the air. So they've sort of made all these proposals before. Obviously the sort of school safety thing is an ongoing discussion and it comes up every time there's another wave. But given this delay, the NDP is sort of taking the opportunity to sort of reintroduce its ideas and propose what it might do to keep schools safer and stop some of the spread there. And the other thing I should mention is that Ontario, which also delayed its return to school, said part of the reason why they delayed the return to school was because given the rates of Omicron in the sort of private sector, they're concerned that they just simply wouldn't have enough teachers in the classroom. No real indication if that's a fear in Alberta, but no doubt the sort of spread among working staff is part of the issue at play here as well.
Our Premier got into a little bit of hot water recently. During a year-end interview with the Calgary Sun, Jason Kenney was asked if there will be another pandemic, And what was his reply?
Yeah, he said, who knows what sort of bat soup thing will come out of Wuhan, which obviously is the city in China where the coronavirus originated. And this was sort of immediately panned as being a racist comment, that this was because of people eating bat soup or something, as opposed to some other way the virus evolved, I guess. And there was actually a protest on New Year's Day in Calgary outside of the McDougall Centre, which is sort of the Calgary Premier's office, for lack of a better way to refer to it. About 60 people were out there demanding an apology, a public apology from the Premier, and he did sort of give one. He gave sort of the classic, "If I offended anyone, I'm sorry for my comments." And this actually came after a couple days of them, the Premier's office, sort of trying to defend this to reporters that were asking questions about it. So I would say actually sort of an atypical slip of the tongue for the Premier on something like this. But yeah, ending the year with a bit of controversy, no doubt about that.
Now, MLAs in our province managed to avoid another Aloha Gate scandal. Last year, you and I talked about a number of politicians, including a cabinet minister who traveled abroad in defiance of travel advisories. Now, it appears as though this winter, more politicians are staying a little closer to home.
Yeah, that's right. There's one person that got out of the country, and we don't actually know who it was. So there's this strange back and forth right before Christmas where the UCP sent a letter to caucus and staff and said, there's no travel advisory right now. You're free to travel. Have a good Christmas. And then, of course, like 3 days later, the federal government issued a travel advisory requesting that people not travel. And so the UCP had to sort of reverse course and say, actually, don't travel over the holiday season. One person had already left, and reporters were told that they were going to be coming back. I don't know who it was. I'm not sure any other reporters do either. And the NDP as well kept all of their people close to home. The rumors flew a little bit at the legislature right before Christmas, but as it turned out, as far as we know, nobody actually traveled. So yeah, they avoided a travel scandal this year. Which is certainly good news for Premier Jason Kenney, because as you mentioned, last year they started off the year in real hot water.
You know what I did with my family? I went to Banff, went to the hot springs, Lake Louise, saw the beautiful ice sculptures on the lake. Be a tourist in your own town, spend the money right here in our province. Spend it locally and support local businesses. Now, Tyler, back in December, a nationwide poll was conducted showing that 50% of Canadians would feel comfortable living in Alberta. I thought it'd be higher, especially that we've got Waterton, we've got the Rockies here, Edmonton's beautiful, Calgary, Lethbridge here. Now, at the time, Premier Kenney called it a drive-by smear on our province because only 50% of Canadians would be comfortable, and demanded to know how many would be comfortable living in Quebec. It turns out not that many. A new poll shows that only about 24% would feel good about living in La Belle Province, and Alberta dropped to 49%, but that was the same number as many other provinces?
Yeah, so Alberta's pretty firmly in the middle of the pack, actually. As you say, this poll came out and just caused like this bizarre sudden controversy when people were upset that it was only 50%. Because as you say, beautiful province, pretty good economic situation. You can afford to buy a house here. Lots of good reasons to live in Alberta. But people in this poll saying that only about half of them would have been comfortable living here. And as you say, as it turned out, in Quebec, it's like 24%. Maybe some good reasons for that. The language probably being an obvious one. If you don't speak French, you're probably not going to want to live in Quebec. But other provinces sort of in that range too. So Manitoba and Saskatchewan came in at 38% of people would feel comfortable living there. Ontario tied with Alberta at 49% in this iteration of the poll. And then, interestingly, Atlantic Canada at 63%. That caught my eye, of course, because Atlantic Canada, in addition to being beautiful, has terrible weather, as we all know. And certainly a lot of people from Atlantic Canada have come to Alberta over the last decade or two. So kind of an interesting dichotomy there, I would say. And then the winner is British Columbia at 65%. And I don't think that's actually a massive surprise, because everyone thinks BC is, the most beautiful province and all those sorts of things, although, maybe they haven't looked at real estate prices in Victoria and Vancouver. But anyways, the point is, this is an answer to this question that Jason Kenney had, and it turns out that he was more or less right to say, well, what about Quebec?
BC, what does it stand for? Bring cash, right? Even a lot of my friends and family in BC would agree with that comment. Now, Tyler, 2 reports on the future of the coal industry here in Alberta have been given to Energy Minister Sonia Savage. Many are in favor of coal mining for the jobs it creates, especially in some of the local regions, but many others are opposed for the potential environmental damage, including affecting our water supply, in particular the Oldman River. Tyler, the province had an independent panel look at the issues. How many Albertans did they hear from?
Well, they heard from about 1,000 people by email. They got 160 some written submissions or 180 some written submissions, and then held, I think it was 67 meetings across the province to discuss this. A little bit of the recent history, there's been sort of a ban on open pit coal mining in the eastern slopes and foothills of the Rockies since about the 1970s, 1976, I think. And last year, the Kenney government was just like, we're doing away with this policy, and then a bunch of companies sort of said, great, we're going to open coal mines. And it was this massive controversy, a complete misstep by the provincial government. And when this controversy blew up, they sort of said, this is, city slickers who don't like coal and they don't want jobs for small towns. And then, Corb Lund spoke out, the Country Star, Paul Brandt, the Country Star, a bunch of small town mayors raised concerns about this. So they really had to back down quite a bit on this policy change. And the panel that you mentioned was a result of this sort of climb down to come up with some more information and strategy and steps forward on this. So we don't know what's in those reports yet. They're supposed to be released at some point in the new year here, but it is notable that panel has wrapped up its work, and we will be hearing from them. And as we look into a new year, I think that's likely to be one of those issues that we do continue to hear about this year, because it's very, very controversial. Not just in the city, not just among New Democrats who obviously oppose it, but in some respects, the real UCP heartland where people have concerns about this. In addition to, in other cases, as you alluded to, wanting the jobs.
Now, Tyler, you wrote a piece late last year about Alberta alienation. It's still a real issue here. Now, the government has its 25 Fair Deal panel recommendations, and while there's been some movement on a few, there may be moving ahead with another one, including a potential provincial police force similar to what Ontario has. Now, as we head into the provincial election next year, should we expect to see more standing up for Alberta rhetoric?
That's what I would predict. Yeah. Alberta alienation, of course, people will remember, was at this real high point in 2019. And I think the pandemic sort of, sideswiped that. It's not at quite as high a level right now. But obviously, the Alberta government went ahead with the equalization referendum back in October. There are, as you said, 25 other possibilities of things they can pursue. They did have a report come out on a potential provincial police force. Ooh, say that 10 times fast. A provincial police force come out a little bit later last year, I suppose. So that's something that could happen there could be more developments on that front in the year to come. And no doubt with an election on the horizon, Jason Kenney is going to be trying to position himself as the man who can stand up for Alberta. Rachel Notley is not the person who can stand up for Alberta. We are certainly going to see that. Whether or not we see some policy come out of this, I think, is the sort of open question, and something I'll be watching really closely, because it's a broad slate of policy options and all kind of interesting stuff.
How much of a threat do you think the Alberta Wildrose Independence Party is to the UCP and potentially splitting the right vote as we head into the provincial election of 2023?
It's a great question, and I'm not that bullish on the Wildrose Independence Party, and the reason I say that is Alberta has elected a actual separatist to the legislature once. I think it was Gordon Kessler in either Olds or Okotoks in like 1983. That's height of the NEP, absolute height of Alberta alienation and separation. So in that sense, I think it would be a long shot. The other bit of evidence I think I have for that is we did have the Maverick Party running in the federal election, which had positioned itself as, maybe not quite a separatist party, but very much an Alberta party, similar to the Reform Party of the past. And they did very, very poorly, surprisingly poorly. I think a lot of people predicted they might have done a little bit better. So the point I'm coming around to making is there's not a lot of evidence that Albertans vote overwhelmingly in a protest fashion, I think. And even then, if we go back, to provincial, the Freedom Conservative Party that Derek Fildebrandt ran for a while there didn't do especially well. So, do I think there's room on the right, I should say, for another conservative party like the Wild Rose Party was, in 2015? I think that's a possibility. But the polling shows a lot of frustration, a lot of kind of openness to think about separation, but that doesn't seem like it translates into outright support for separation. And I think that's where the Wild Rose Independence Party is going to have a fair bit of trouble. But, and I know I'm being long-winded here, we do have a by-election in Fort McMurray, and I believe the leader of the Wild Rose Independence Party, Paul Hinman, who is a former Wild Rose guy, I believe he is running in that by-election against Brian Jean. So he doesn't necessarily have a fabulous chance at winning, if I'm being frank about it, but how he does in that, I think we can maybe take as a little bit of a bellwether about how people feel about that party. So sorry to ramble on, but it's a great question, and there's lots of stuff to think about on that front.
Yeah, we'll have to keep an eye on that, absolutely, with Brian Jean and Hinman up in Fort McMurray. Tyler, the UCP has a bit of time to rebuild its image, and the same thing for Jason Kenney heading into the next provincial election. What will it take? Will it be more spending across the province? Bigger promises?
Well, yeah, it's a great question. No, I think it's going to be the economy turning around, and I think that Jason Kenney is going to wear some of the mistakes of the pandemic, and certainly the New Democrats are going to try and make him wear some of the mistakes of the pandemic. But as someone told me recently, it might have been Ted Morton when I was speaking to him. $80 per barrel of oil plasters over an awful lot of problems. So I think for the UCP, that's sort of what they're hoping for, that the economy does better and better and better coming into 2023. But there are other political considerations. A balanced budget's going to make a difference. Holding the line on not introducing something like a sales tax is going to make a difference. Successfully implementing the childcare stuff, which is supposed to be rolling out in the weeks to come, is going to be, a big issue for suburban families and things like that. So there's a bunch of other issues sort of percolating here. The big one for me, I think, has got to be the economy. I don't see a path back to the Premier's office if the economy, completely collapses, because they campaigned in 2018 on recovering the economy. And if they can't say they did that, then I think they're in a fair bit of trouble.
Yeah, we have to get more Albertans working, absolutely, to help the economy rebound. Our legislative reporter and the Alberta correspondent for the National Post, Tyler Dawson, thanks for joining me today from Edmonton.
Always a pleasure, Hal.